you and I have been reflecting a lot this week on just even the word resilience, right? Like, what does it mean to be resilient? And is this notion of like, we shall rebuild and stand strong and maintain the status quo, like, is that truly what resilience is? Or is it the ability and the courage to transform and adapt to the realities that we are facing?
Hi everybody, I'm Makena Coffman. I'm the director for the Institute for Sustainability and Resilience at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, and I'm very pleased to be here today with Rosanna Xia. She's an environmental reporter with the LA Times and a Pulitzer Prize finalist for her work on coasts and oceans, and particularly sea level rise. Rosanna, thanks for being here.
Thank you, Makena. It's just been so wonderful to spend the week with you. I have felt so much love from so many people on campus.
Great. Well, let's start a little bit with your book. So you wrote a book about California's coasts, and this book really resonated with me because the clarity with which you wrote about such a complex problem of how to deal with sea level rise, and again the sort of clear messaging and writing, but also showing the nuance of the storytelling. Can you tell us a little bit about your process in writing in the book, why you chose to put it in a book format as a journalist?
Thank you. It really means a lot to hear you say this. And I think it was quite a journey. And as I've been reflecting on the journey of writing and reporting this book, I feel like it also kind of reflects the evolution of the issue itself and how scientists and other experts and researchers and policymakers have been thinking about not only the issue and how we wrap our minds around it, but also how we communicate it. So when I first started writing about sea level rise almost 10 years ago now, I feel like I was perpetuating and reflecting kind of the way the studies and the projections and the numbers and the data points were coming out. So a new study will come out and say that, new sea level rise projections show that, the sea could rise as much as 7 feet by the end of the century, and California is at risk of losing, more than 2/3 of its beaches. All our coastal wetlands, our salt marshes as an entire ecosystem can go extinct. More than $370 billion in property could be at flood risk by end of century. And so each of these data points I would write as a breaking news story. It would go on the front page, it would make a big splash online, people react and go, oh my God, the problem is huge. And then the next day they move on. And so part one for me was realizing that the data alone was not necessarily telling the story. It was identifying the problem, but it wasn't advancing the conversation. And so I started thinking as a journalist, how do I step out of kind of these one-off news cycles that weren't quite sustaining the conversation? And from there, it's been interesting. It started as like a modeling conversation, a science conversation. It's become a policy conversation, a social conversation. All of the research that you're doing now is connecting so many of these different dots and these different realms of expertise that are all required to understand this problem. And so I think part two of my shift in the way I think about this problem was I started, going to all these different communities up and down the California coast. And the California coast is massive. It's 1,200 miles long just on the outer coast from Oregon all the way to Mexico. And that's not including like the 400 miles of inner shoreline along San Francisco Bay. And I would go to all these different communities, and in every single place, sea level rise was such a looming question, an existential crisis. And I'd go to these planning commission meetings and these city council meetings, and it was just so fraught. There was so much debate. It was controversial. People were really, really frustrated and really, really angry. Public comments would go for 9 hours. And I remember every single time I went to one of these places and one of these meetings, I'd call my editor and I'd be like, oh my God, this is a story. There's conflict, there's tension. Everyone's up in arms. Like, let's write a story. I can get this on the front page by Sunday as a feature. And he was just like, wait. He's like, let's hit pause. Rather than write the same story 60 times from 60 different places, basically exploring the same question, just with slightly different characters and slightly different pieces, what's the bigger story here? And so this was like 2017, 2018. And I think at that point, I was realizing that there was all these larger thematic connections that we needed to start to piece together. And also we needed to start thinking more collectively about the landscape, right? Just because one city boundary ends here and their seawall ends here does not mean the ocean cares about, what's on the other side of that seawall. And as we started to piece together this bigger story of the California coastline and what it means to rethink our relationship to the rising ocean, the longer, we call them long form stories in journalism, the long form narrative stories started to really shift these conversations into a more collective way of thinking about the issue, and ultimately it led to a book. Sorry.
Oh, that's great. And I mean, it seems like you had this amazing opportunity to take the years of work you've done along California's coast, but also had a really supportive editor who helped you think about, like, okay, how do we tell this big story, which is, journalism, but it's storytelling and narrative in a way that often, like, a newspaper format doesn't allow for, right? So it's just great to hear that sort of transition and how do we move from that. And also just reflecting on my own experience working in sea level rise. So I started getting really interested in sea level rise topics when I was in graduate school. And I remember starting to read the climate science and starting to read the sea level rise projections. And the amount of, at that point, just like the amount of science uncertainty was still there, that as a social scientist, I was a little bit like, oh wait, nope, I need to do something else for my dissertation because I will never finish if I do this for my dissertation. But the interest for me was there, right? And I came back to it many years later after feeling like now the physical science was so solid, right? We had all of these great models and projections and kind of knowledge about impacts on the physical side, and now it was time to put it into the social science space, right? What do we do as people to deal with this, right? So,
right, and I'm also remembering, so I just, like, years ago, I was on the beach walking with, like, a really renowned coastal engineer who's, helped a number of coastal communities in California do the step one process of the planning process for sea level rise. So they would identify the vulnerabilities along the coastline, kind of figure out the hot spots, and then, kind of do the first crack at a cost benefit analysis, and also just, like, map out your different adaptation strategies and, like, here are your options in terms of the what do we do about sea level rise question. And in every community where he introduced, his reports, like, the community exploded. It became an emotional conversation rather than a conversation grounded in the facts. And it was because it was demanding people to start to think about the future in a way that made them feel like a lot of sacrifices were on the horizon. And so I remember kind of meeting up with him, and after, like, yet another planning commission meeting where he was just grilled for hours and had to listen to so many people, really convey their frustrations, he told me, he's like, Rosanna, this is not a science problem anymore. This is not an engineering problem. It's a social problem. It's a political problem. And he was just like, I've done all of the hard numbers. The science is clear. This is what we need to do if we want to make the most cost-efficient decision going forward. This is what we should do if we want to account for the greatest amount of life safety, as we think about our communities in the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years. He's like, but people don't want to listen, and we have to honor that. We have to think about the emotional aspects of this conversation. And he was just like, and that's not my expertise. And I'm like, this is a guy with 6 engineering licenses in 6 different states, and he's like, this is beyond my expertise.
So you write about this really well in your book, and you do it by telling sort of stories of different communities that have dealt with it in different ways. Can you share a little bit about some of those, maybe the different approaches communities are taking in that conversation?
Yeah, and it's interesting. So going back to my LA Times editor, he was like, okay, let's hit pause. Like, rather than write 60 stories from 60 different places, kind of what are the connecting threads? And one theme that emerged pretty quickly for me is that everyone who was talking about the problem, thinking about the problem, acknowledged the problem, but there was also kind of this, like, feeling of there's got to be, like, some solution that hasn't emerged yet that will just fall into our laps and that will solve everything. And people kept waiting for a better option because the existing options just weren't politically viable, it was too costly. They were non-starters for a lot of communities. And as I was going through kind of talking to all these different experts, I realized that there are only a certain set of options, and you can categorize them in, like, a couple pretty broad groups. So one is, like, oceans moving in, you build a seawall, you try to hold a hard line against the most massive body of water on the planet. Seawalls come with their consequences. They're they're expensive. A lot of communities are now seeing that seawalls, in order to actually make them effective, you need to make them bigger. There's a lot of maintenance issues, and it's, again, who's going to pay for a seawall that is big enough to serve the needs of the community? And also, there are unintended consequences. When you harden a shoreline like that, the beach in front, gets eroded. It totally changes the dynamic of the sand erosion and the sand replenishment processes along the beach. And as one environmentalist put it to me super bluntly, seawalls kill beaches. And that's something that a lot of people are not conscious of when they think that seawalls are the answer. Second kind of general universe of solutions is sand replenishment. A community goes, okay, seawalls kill beaches. Our beach is shrinking. We don't want to move. So let's just make the beach wide again. Let's truck in sand from somewhere and just pad out the beach. And the problem with that is it's also really costly to maintain. Where does the sand come from? There were a lot of interesting examples, early examples of how, someone brought sand from somewhere else and it was too coarse or it was too fine and the sand washed away or totally ruined the ecology of the existing beach. So finding the sediment that was proper for the beach was a very complicated process. And sand renourishment has worked in some places, but it really required a lot of money, intentional thinking, and also kind of where you're sourcing the sand. Third option is to elevate buildings. I think that's something that has not been very feasible in a lot of places in California because a lot of our coastline is cliff backed. But you see these places in on the East Coast where roads are getting elevated, homes are getting elevated. And then the fourth option was managed retreat. And we can probably talk about managed retreat for a very long time. Truly the most fraught, most poorly branded term, I think, in the coastal world. It's just, oh man, in places that I visited, even just the introduction of the words managed retreat could cause such immense emotional backlash. And, no one wants to be managed. Retreat feels like failure, but managed retreat ultimately is just acknowledging that the water is moving in, the shoreline is supposed to move inland with it, and we're supposed to move with that. And what does it mean to intentionally consider relocating certain critical infrastructure, certain communities out of the way of the ocean before we're in the way, in a way that is fair, that is cost effective, and that is wise, and ultimately, how do we give more space for the ocean, for the beach?
So when we think about the term managed retreat, right, and there's been a lot of going back and forth in the coastal planning world about are those the words we should use, or should we use other things like strategic realignment or what have you?
Planned relocation.
Planned relocation, right? There's a lot of words. Are the words really the issue versus to me, I would think it's, of course, the words we use matter, but it's also just when you're talking about moving somebody's home, that it's going to be emotional no matter what you call it, right? Adaptive pathways, right? Yeah. So how do we think about that broader narrative and the sort of grappling with this sort of, private interest, which I think we're all very empathetic towards, and public interest of the beach?
Yeah, and I think wording is part of it. It's also how you introduce the wording. I think, I saw in a number of places where the first time a homeowner or a community found out that their home was in a designated zone that might be part of a managed retreat plan at 30, 40 years from now, potentially, there's a lot of ifs and a lot of uncertainties, was, in a planning document that got released. And I think there's a lot more improvement these days with, the planning process, especially on this issue, and the consciousness of needing to start with the community in a different way and introducing the problem. But ultimately, I think the questions that come up, we don't have a lot of clear answers. And I really have a lot of empathy for homeowners who, especially longtime homeowners who own family homes rather than, aren't inherently wealthy, who have questions like, okay, so if my property is designated as a place that might need to relocate at some point in the future, and we don't know if that's 10 years from now or 30 years from now or 60 years from now, how does that affect my ability to refinance my home? What does that mean does that affect the way I'm going to have to renew my insurance? And those questions, I hear it, and they're there are not, kind of in a world where we need certainty, like there's so much uncertainty in how the manage retreat process would work. And I think that's something that a lot of folks in the space have been trying to create more clarity on, whether it's through the legal system or through policy and planning. But I really hear the concerns and questions from folks who are trying to engage on the issue, but are just really worried about what it means for their immediate future.
I think that's one of the really difficult things about the sea level rise science, right, is because although we know sea level rise is certainly happening, how much and by when is still uncertain, right? And so that changes the timing of this conversation, which dramatically changes outcomes like, can I get a mortgage, right? So you mentioned insurance, and I wanted to talk a little bit more about that in terms of like what, particularly with the wildfires happening in Los Angeles and the dramatic changes to the insurance industry in the last few years. What is your sense about how the insurance industry will shape sea level rise adaptation moving forward in California and elsewhere?
That is like one of the key questions. And just two quick thoughts to what you said earlier before we dive into insurance. The term slow moving disaster comes up so often in the sea level rise space. I'm sure you've run into too. It's like, wildfires like the ones that are devastating Los Angeles right now, they're dramatic, they're terrifying, they're so heartbreaking, and sea level rise is too, but just on a different sense. Like the time scale feels different. Like you can't stand on a beach for one afternoon and look at the ocean and feel the disaster, but it is something that also needs to be accounted for. And if you look at the projections in totality, it will be equally, if not worse, in devastation. And the other thing, just to acknowledge quickly, like when I'm in the field, especially I'll just speak for coastal California, like climate change denial is like I'm not running into deniers. Like the debate in California is not whether or not climate change is happening, it's time. How much time do we have? And I still do run into a lot of folks who are saying like, oh, the projections keep changing, the science is not solid yet, like this is something that we don't have to worry about in our generation. And to folks like that, like I sometimes gently say like, yes, the numbers keep changing, and I do feel like all models are wrong in some ways, but they all speak to a truth. And the one consistent thing over the years, even though the projections keep changing, is the direction in which we're going, right? Like, and I think that's something to help kind of focus the messaging on. And to your point on insurance, I mean, it's so interesting. Like I feel like there are all these dominoes set up already, and someone once that first one gets pushed, there's all these other things, all these questions and uncertainties that people are trying to work around and talk around or trying to address but really can't get clear answers on. Like once that first domino hits, like so many things will fall into place. And the question within the research world, the policy world that I keep running to is, who's going to push that first domino? Is it going to be the government through some kind of policy or new legislation? Is it going to be through some lawsuit that establishes a new legal precedent in how a law is implemented or interpreted? Is it going to be the free market and, the way insurance and mortgage and just property values operate? And I think, a lot of folks are now looking to the insurance market as like possibly most likely the thing that's going to shift a lot of these conversations. Because if a home that is in a hazard zone, either a hazard zone now or a hazard zone that will be at some point in the future, if you can't get insurance on your home, how does that affect your decision making in terms of whether or not to rebuild, whether or not to stay, whether or not to continue to renovate? And with something like the fires, or even like any situation where a home floods, the insurance industry historically has been set up in a way where you lose a home and you get money to rebuild exactly what you lost at exactly where you lost it. And this idea of kind of redesigning or rethinking and building back better, quote unquote, and I'm putting it in quotes because I feel like words are so important in the way we communicate this. Our notion of resilience when it comes to how historically we've responded post-disaster is, measured by our ability to remain unchanged, whether or not we're strong enough to rebuild and to like stay strong and hold the line on what it is that we've already built and held on to, rather than rethinking what isn't working and how we can do it differently. And so I think the way insurance will play into this conversation, a lot of people are waiting to see what happens. We're starting to see it in certain wildfire zones in California where insurance companies are pulling out of giving insurance, to renewing their insurance policies. But, and ultimately, like, I've heard this from so many folks, like, kind of in more unofficial conversations, like insurance companies, private insurance companies are like the best at calculating risk, right? They actually turn uncertainty into frameworks of risk that then allow them to think through what kind of risks they're willing to take on. And so I think even at just like a high level kind of way of thinking about this, like, I mean, if the professionals of risk are saying this is a place that we no longer feel like is worth taking, like if this is a risk that's not worth taking, like I think we should be listening and keeping our eyes on it.
It's a really important point, right? Because I think often the government reaction has been to create programs to help, like the NFIP being the National Flood Insurance Program, right, being kind of a perfect example of this. It serves a lot of people to keep the status quo, and there's a lot of benefit in that in terms of, keeping people in their homes and other things. But then the cost side is that we are also putting people in risky places and perpetuating risky places, right? So the conversations around NFIP are just sort of, in my mind, the starting point of the conversations around insurance that's affecting all these different types of hazards now.
Right, and you and I have been reflecting a lot this week on just even the word resilience, right? Like, what does it mean to be resilient? And is this notion of like, we shall rebuild and stand strong and maintain the status quo, like, is that truly what resilience is? Or is it the ability and the courage to transform and adapt to the realities that we are facing in, increasing frequency and intensity? And, it's like, I see over and over again these like 100-year storms and these 1 billion plus disasters that are affecting so many parts of the country. And it is hard because I think it's so important to attend to the emotional aspects, but like, when these families have just lost their homes, have nowhere to go, are just trying to survive in the aftermath, and, our elected officials and government leadership are just trying to resume, like, to recover and, find some sense of stability, like the trauma too, like to add that extra level of like, actually, like, here are all these other things you should think about before you just get to rebuild your home and try to just find a sense of normalcy again. It's a hard conversation. I think, a lot of folks who are working actively in the space like are thinking like, how can we be better prepared to have those conversations when a disaster strikes, rather than trying to have those conversations in live time when also we're just trying to make sure that we are saving lives and saving as many people as possible.
Certainly that's been a really hard thing in sort of the rebuilding of Lahaina and the rethinking of land post Lahaina here. And so after like an acute disaster, that's always going to be the case in this sort of new normal of climate change. But sea level rise has a different flavor to it, right? Which is kind of an interesting thing because of the slow moving disaster aspect. That when I look at a lot of the federal programs for buyouts, for example, right? Federal buyout programs for properties, they speak to sea level rise, but you have to wait for a hurricane to intersect with sea level rise, right? And if we do that in a place like Hawaii, we'll have no beaches left, right? If we wait for that disaster. So again, to me, it's this post-disaster planning or pre-disaster planning is maybe, it's overly climate useful, but sea level rise has a different kind of planning framework to it. Right,
and it tends to be reactive, right? Like a home falls into an ocean due to a confluence of things that still feel like a one-off, and it becomes a news cycle, everyone reacts to it, blame gets pointed in all different directions, and then we kind of tuck it away into our collective narrative of like, oh, like this person could have done this differently, or this was a unique situation on this specific place, and then the sun keeps shining and we move on, and then we're surprised again when it happens all over again with another big wave event or another El Nino. And it's interesting to be able to think beyond the parcel by parcel, neighborhood by neighborhood, beach by beach approach is I think, truly a challenge in the sea level rise space, but also, in so many spaces and so many meetings that I'm in, like sea level rise, responding to sea level rise is still being perceived as like this big, scary, one-time action that we have to take. Like planning for sea level rise is now hinged on like this one massive planning document that is a yes or no vote before the California Coastal Commission or a planning commission or a local city government. And it's not, it's a process, right? Like it's a very long-term ongoing process, but that's a really tricky thing to communicate as well. So how do we help people recognize that things are going to change? I think everyone on a gut level knows that something about where they live and what they love is going to feel different or look different 30, 40, 50 years from now, but none of those changes are going to happen tomorrow. So like how do you inspire someone to help to start taking those small steps towards this different future without making it feel like they're doing it all in one go? So I think that's key to translating the short term into the long term, and I think where a lot of communities in California at least are stuck is this middle transition period.
Do you see any can you think of communities that you've engaged with that are doing it better than others, particularly at this moving from the parcel to the regional scale?
Yeah, I think the communities where they have started the conversation in community with not just necessarily the problem and all of the scary numbers, but kind of starting the conversation with what do you value as a community? What do you, the community, want us, the city, to prioritize in terms of what you want your shoreline to look like, let's just say 30 or 40 years from now. And I think the places that have been able to start the conversation on what it is that a community values the energy has been different in terms of where that conversation starts and how it develops and moves forward. There are a few places, I'm thinking about the town of Marina along the Monterey Bay in California, and that community is, working class, huge refugee community, really has stood as a community by the principle that the beach is a public space for everyone. The first time I drove into Marina was right before sunset, and I pulled into the main State Beach parking lot, and I felt like half the town was there just enjoying the sunset together. And it just felt like a daily event in the community. And Marina, someone told me, on background that, like, someone described to me that Marina is the industrial armpit of the Monterey Bay. So Monterey is, a lot of wealthier communities, but Marina along the bay is where all the industrial zoning happened. And it was also kind of the site of the last major sand mine operation in the country. And it's where the wastewater treatment facilities are. It's where the recycling is. It's where the landfills are. It's where the discussions of like desalination operation could be placed if the region needed more water. And Marina, the leadership currently in place at Marina saw managed retreat, they celebrated the term as like an opportunity to deindustrialize their shoreline. Because, in a world where we have created sacrifice zones, certain places have been zoned for industrial use, right? And so even when something like the sand mine finally gets shut down because that parcel on the beach is zoned for industrial use, when a new industrial project needs to come into the region, they immediately look at parcels like that can be, they don't have to be rezoned for other uses. Like, let's just cite that project there again. So for Marina, this was an opportunity to take a stand and have a community-led conversation on reclaiming their beaches as a public resource and deindustrializing their shoreline. I remember someone telling me in Marina, like, we're not afraid of managed retreat. Managed retreat is just marching in a different direction. In this case, this is a direction that is better for most of our community. And and I took a lot of inspiration from that.
So that's fascinating. I love that story. And I mean, I've read a lot about people sort of framing sea level rise adaptation as an opportunity for restoration, and it sounds like Marina is maybe a really good example of that, for maybe some of the historical land uses that were unfairly distributed, right? And so, taking that idea of restoration, I really loved the chapter in your book around thinking about the beaches as wild places. Can you talk a little bit about that and the reconceptualizing of this space that we humans interact with all the time?
Oh my God. goodness, I know like in Hawaii it's a lot more nuanced, but in California, like so many people still think of the coast as static, like as a place that doesn't move. And I was so guilty of that too when I first moved out to California from the East Coast. And you know, you look at these wide and sandy and artificially groomed beaches in Santa Monica, and you forget that the beach itself is an ecosystem, and it's a wild place that, you know, coyotes and foxes used to roam, and there were birds and plants and bugs and kelp rack that, you know, that stayed on the shore and didn't get just, you know, cleaned up in a way for the sake of recreation. And so I think there's been a lot of interesting, there are restoration projects, but not necessarily restoration. I'm going to put a pin in that because I have a lot of thoughts on the word restoration. But there's an interesting movement in different pockets of the California shoreline, just kind of reintroducing this idea of like how do we make these in-between spaces, these wetlands and these sand dunes and the beach itself, a place that is also more wild. And I think this concept that's really gaining momentum in California, this notion of leveraging nature's existing wisdom along the shoreline in, you know, the face of sea level rise, has been something that's captivated a lot of people's imaginations. There was a pilot dune restoration project in Santa Monica where a bunch of conservationists and researchers set aside like 3 acres of beach that is usually groomed every day for beach volleyball and, you know, just laying your towel down on a flat, unbumpy space. And they, you know, roped it off as like kind of a demonstration, and they planted all these native dune plants, sand verbena, beach evening primrose, and allowed for, you know, the plants will grow. They're salt spray resistant, they're wind resistant, they're meant to be on the beach, and all the sand dunes started to grow and accumulate. And in 4 years, like, you can now see kind of the texture of what the beach used to look like and is supposed to look like, and seeing how even during like high wave events, the dunes responded and served as a natural buffer against against flooding, where the rest of the beach kind of responded differently. And the first snowy plover nest in like 70 years appeared a year after the dunes first started to emerge, and everyone was just enchanted. And I think, you know, this is not a solution everywhere, but I think even just like inspiring more people to like truly be present to what the beach could be rather than what it should be, and to fall in love with the wonder of these spaces has really also been a really wonderful way to just get more people involved and actively thinking about what it is that they actually want from their shoreline.
And so one of the things I think coastal planners grapple with a lot here and everywhere is, you know, who are these people, right? Like, how do we think about who is the community when we talk about a public space like the beach, right? In planning, communities are often defined spatially by residents, right? But beaches go much beyond residential boundaries with different people who care for that space for a variety of reasons. Can you describe when you were, you know, when you in your interrogation of the California coastline, how people were defining community in that space and maybe how it differed?
Yeah, I mean, the public, who is the public, right? That's and you know, the California Coastal Act, you know, makes the philosophical stand that the beach belongs to everyone, that public access is an inherent fundamental right of all Californians. But who gets to be in that umbrella? If you're a private property owner who lives on the beach, you would say you're part of the public and you're part of that definition. And then also, like, it isn't just residents, but I also think that residents need to be included in that as well. I think, you know, in the last few years in Los Angeles, I just think of all the massive heat waves that we have in the inland valleys and in the high desert, and like, people need to come to the beach. Like, they drive an hour and a half to the beach just to get the 20-degree, you know, heat temperature difference, the gentle cool breeze, and the nature's air conditioning. And those people who live an hour and a half away from the beach also belong in this conversation. And it did take me years, and it took planners also years to kind of help people understand, like, this is also a problem that you belong in that this is a conversation that you belong in. Because when I first started reaching out to folks like in the Inland Empire, they'd be like, oh, this is not something I need to worry about. This is a rich person problem. I don't own a home on the beach. And it's like, no, anyone who wants to go to the beach has a say in this and should have a say in this. And a lot of my work in the last few years on writing about sea level rise is not only looking at who's been at the table talking about this, but who isn't at the table that should be actively invited into the conversation. And I think there's been also a lot of really inspiring momentum to bring more Indigenous perspectives in California into these conversations. The history of Native Californians is so heartbreaking and, extra complex, in certain ways because of our history with Mexico. And I have met so many incredible coastal Indigenous communities, but so many of them were pushed out and now priced out. And even just hearing someone tell me like even though their people are native to living by the sea, all of their practices and culture and even the songs that they sing to their children speak of the ocean, like their kids have never necessarily seen the ocean or interacted with the ocean. And that's just heartbreaking. And I think to be able to reclaim kind of those, to help these native coastal Indigenous communities reclaim their relationship to the ocean, I think we can also learn a lot from the knowledge that still exists, that still is passed down generation to generation, but not necessarily physically enacted because of the lack of access to these spaces.
Well, in one of the last parts of your book, you tell this really amazing story of a Native Californian tribe who was able to, I think through a land swap, actually reclaim land next to the coast. And it was, anyway, I thought that was like a really hopeful sort of part of your ending of your book. Can you tell us a little bit about that and sort of, I guess I always have questions of like, okay, how do we do this more systematically? What are the structures, right? Just share your thoughts.
Yeah, it was unprecedented too. And the Trust for Public Land, like one of their real estate experts helped navigate all of the unprecedented steps in terms of having a piece of property on the coast transferred into ownership by a sovereign, federally recognized tribal nation. And there was a lot of really interesting compromises too on how to make that purchase, how to help the tribe which could not afford the purchase make that purchase. There was a willing landowner who grew up, that was the son of a family that grew up next door to the reservation and went to school with so many of the children from that tribal nation. And when this landowner was ready to retire the ranch, he was willing, he couldn't afford to just give the land away, but the main, he only wanted to sell it to the nation. And so it was a really remarkable story of all these different agencies coming together. There were, the land trust, regional parks, and different kind of agencies that all deal with land use and land transactions and public easements, all of that. Everyone had to come together and figure out, okay, we've never done this before, but how do we make it work? And it was a great example of just brainstorming together within the systems that already exist to make something unprecedented happen. And not to fully give the ending away, but I will say it's interesting, the ending took, and I'm so glad you brought up the ending, because I really didn't want this book to be doom and gloom, but I also didn't know what kind of emotional note I would necessarily wanted to end the book on. Definitely not depressing, but there's, a lot of other, the range is still wide, from not depressing to super hopeful and too hopeful. But how do you end a book where the ending is still to be written based on all of the decisions that we make or choose not to make today? I knew actually pretty early on how to start the book. The book begins with the Chumash, which are the people native to present day Malibu and Santa Barbara. And actually, being in Hawaii this week, I've been thinking so much about the parallels and similarities between the Chumash culture and their connection to the ocean and the native Hawaiian notions of reciprocity with the ocean, and also just the origins on like as island people. So the Chumash have, so it begins with the story of the Chumash, the Rainbow Bridge story. And I just remember I was walking along the beach with Alicia Cordero, who's a member of the coastal band of the Chumash Nation. And she's a trained biologist, so trained in Western science, but also someone who is a cultural educator for her community. And, you know, I was like, hey, like I've been trying to write this book on sea level rise, like, what are your thoughts on like bringing, like what's your thinking around this? And you know, Alicia and I, whenever I'm in the area, we'll try to meet up and just have a conversation. And she's like, you know, the Rainbow Bridge story, it's like, you know, one of their creation stories and such a beloved story, like, you know, even elementary schools in Santa Barbara now teach it. She was like, it's so magical, it's so beautiful. But she's like, but I also think it's the first potentially oral record of sea level rise in California. And I, in that moment, was like, oh my God, like, I need to, that's how I opened the book. Like, let's introduce this story, not just as a story or a myth or a legend, but as a data point. And I think, you know, so often we think about, you know, I think about, you know, who we tend to value as expert in these conversations. And I really wanted to braid kind of Indigenous knowledge with Western science in a book that is so, in a book about an issue that is so often rooted in just what the Western science says. And so I knew I was going to start with the Chumash story, and then I spent years trying to figure out where this ending, what the ending of this book was going to be, what kind of ending I was writing towards. And with the Kashaya, which is the tribal nation at the ending, I just remember talking to the now former tribal chairman of the tribal nation. He's telling me the story of the land swap, and I just had chills. I was like, oh my God, this is the ending. And it wasn't intentional, but when I reached the end of my draft of the book, I was like, there's something so meaningful that the book gives the Chumash the first word and the Kashaya the last. And so often we write about Indigenous communities, at least in California, when we talk about these issues, in the past tense, right? Like they used to be here, they did this, they used to think this, but they're still very much here with us in present day. They are our neighbors, they are our friends, they are our colleagues, and what they have to say is so critical to how we think about the future. And so to be able to give the Chumash the first word in the book, but ultimately the Kashaya the last word, as we're thinking about this ending that is still yet to be written, to have them be centered in this conversation going into the future, just felt so right. And it wasn't something that I had like planned for, but just the fact that my journey of reporting and writing and talking to all these different people in all these different fields and all these different communities, the fact that my reporting ultimately led me to this ending at this point in time just felt so meaningful.
That's amazing. I mean, so I loved the way you wove together these different ways of knowing, right? From different kinds of knowledge systems, right? Like, so from people who've been on the land for generations, people who've related to the coast for generations, people who might live there now, right? And what is that sort of emotional response? The physical science community, the social scientists are kind of trying to come up with policy, right? And then and also just this broader community of the people who use and relate to these places. And I love the vignettes you put together of these different communities. So yes, I really appreciated that.
Someone once told me, I was talking to a writer friend, this is a little side note, but just, you know, I was like, oh my goodness, after this book, I'm going to only write fiction because writing nonfiction is way too hard. There's just like, you know, the fact checking alone was just like such an intense process. And this writer friend who's a novelist, she's like, I think fiction's harder. And so we had this like really nerdy conversation. And she quoted a writing professor who said that writing nonfiction is like trying to pull together a story from all the sounds on a busy street and to write music, you know, based on what you're able to gather. And writing fiction is like trying to compose a song in a silent room. And I love that because it helped me realize that I had met so many people who had such a love for the ocean, who had such care for their community, who had such wise ways of thinking about this issue, and who had such different perspectives and expertise. And every single person helped me put together this beautiful like song that we're all singing together. And I think that, you know, ultimately someone, like, you know, a question that has come up a lot since the book came out is like Rosanna, what surprised you the most during your process of writing this book? And the first time I was asked this, I was kind of stumped, and I like stumbled through the question until I found my answer. And I realized what surprised me the most was the amount of commonality I actually found in what people had to say about this issue. And once you get even people completely on opposite sides of an argument, and once you get past the first few layers of anger and frustration and finger pointing, like I realized, like, everyone loves California, everyone loves the ocean, everyone chose to be in this conversation for a reason, and ultimately everyone had concerns and worries and care for what the future will look like for future generations. And I think once we were able to stitch together a lot of that commonality, like, there is no real villain in the book, and I think that just approaching this conversation and this topic with deeper empathy, I think is going to be so important, because we need every single person on all sides of the issue to be on board and willing to move into the future together. And I think that even this book alone was a practice in realizing that we can do so much when we do choose to come together.
That feels like a really good note to end on. And Rosanna, I just really want to thank you for making this trip to Hawaii, particularly, what's happening in LA with the wildfires is heartbreaking, and we're just really grateful to you for being here in the midst of that.
Thank you. No, I'm so grateful to be here. I have learned so much just being here. And I was sharing this with you yesterday, like Hawaii, I feel Hawaii more than I had expected. I feel the love, I feel the care, I feel the community, and that's something I will be thinking about for a very long time. And I've learned so much, and my mind is exploding on all the things I'm going to take back home to share with folks. And this conversation, I have no doubt this conversation will continue.
Well, thank you so much, everybody, for listening in today. This program is part of the Better Tomorrow Speaker Series at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. The Better Tomorrow Speaker Series is sponsored by the UH Foundation, the Hawaii Community Foundation, and Kamehameha Schools. And in particular, the partnership to bring Rosanna out here was between the Institute for Sustainability and Resilience, the School of Journalism, and SSFM International.